Hey, it's Chris from Military Aviation History, and today I want to talk about the F-16 deliveries that are going to Ukraine. And for this, I've invited Professor Justin Bronk from the Royal United Services Institute to talk to me about that. We are going to be discussing the F-16 in itself, the weapon systems that might be sent, the complexities, the challenges, and also the benefits and the opportunities that may be behind that, and also what sort of mission profiles we will likely see at the start of this F-16 introduction into the Ukrainian Air Force. So without further ado, big thank you to all the patrons and channel members for funding this sort of content. Let's go straight to the interview. So Justin, thanks for being back. And I wanted to talk to you about the F-16 deliveries that are going to the Ukrainian Air Force now. And I'm starting this off with probably something we shouldn't do, but for simplicity reason, I want to do it, is separating the aircraft, so the F-16, a little bit from the armaments that it carries, that obviously are key to actually telling us what they can do with the aircraft. But let's stay F-16 centric for now. What sort of capabilities, benefits do you see with the F-16 platform in itself that will benefit the Ukrainian Air Force over their current inventory?
The core benefit to the F-16 for Ukraine is the fact that it has a great deal of flexibility in terms of the weapons it can carry, as the sort of cheap and cheerful, relatively speaking, NATO single-engine fighter. It's qualified for most weapons, air-to-air and air-to-surface, in the American inventory, and quite a few European ones. So in that sense, it's very flexible. It's also significantly cheaper and easier to operate than twin-engined heavy fighters, F-15, F-18 even, certainly Eurofighter or Rafale. In many ways, it makes a great deal of sense, and there's a lot of them around. So there's a large global spares organization and sort of pool to draw from. There's a lot of maintenance technicians, particularly in industry, who have served time as uniformed technicians in one air force or another on F-16. So there's a lot of kind of support capacity there. In terms of its attributes as an aircraft, it's fairly easy to fly, although a little bit more tricky to fly very accurately. The sensitivity of the small side stick, at least for newbies, is it tends to lead to a bit of wobbling around at first, particularly in the yaw axis. But it's a comfortable and very easy aircraft to fly once you get the hang of it. And compared to their existing aircraft, in particular, I think one of the core advantages will be a reasonably capable radar warning receiver. To it, once you get used to it, again, it does require quite a bit of interpretation to use accurately, kind of on the fly, no pun intended, especially when things are getting busy. But it will be a huge improvement over the existing radar warning receivers. So they should have a significantly better situational awareness when they're being targeted and by what, compared to the current jets that are flying. On the other hand, the radar is really pretty limited. It's quite a small nose aperture. It's quite a small array, therefore. It's a mech scan that they'll be getting, almost certainly the APG 68. And so it will have relatively limited range performance in terms of the distances at which it can pick up and reliably track or launch against hostile aircraft, particularly in a relatively heavy electronic warfare environment. And that's both a function of just the capabilities of the radar in terms of functional detection range, and also the fact that it tends to produce quite a lot of clutter. The more complex the environment you're using it in, and the further out you're trying to track things, the more you'll be having to work really hard as a pilot to separate out what's clutter and what's not.
Yeah, then jumping into the armaments, which really, we'll talk about sort of what mission sets the Ukrainian would be flying most likely in the immediate future. But since you already mentioned the armaments, so obviously F-16 is quite a flexible platform with air-to-ground and air-to-air weaponry. Depending on what can be delivered, what would the F-16s probably use?
The air-to-air weapons will be a mix of AIM-120 AMRAAM and AIM-9 Sidewinder, almost certainly. The key question will be what version of AIM-120. There are AMRAAMs and there are AMRAAMs. And in particular, it's worth, if you look at what beyond visual range air-to-air combat involves, it tends to involve quite a lot of shots that are not likely to actually connect with the target. You fire in order to put an opponent on the defensive, to force them to react, to notch, to turn cold potentially, allowing you to close the distance or trash missile shots that they might have fired. In other words, there's going to be quite a few shots in any BVR engagement at any scale, particularly against maneuvering aware ECM equipped targets like flankers, that don't connect. And therefore, since you're firing them over the border, and quite a few of them are not going to connect, some of them will inevitably not destroy themselves in whatever mechanism they're using. And so pretty soon you will have semi-intact versions of those missiles that will be being analyzed by Russian specialists, and not only Russian, but also Chinese, Iranian, and other Russian allies. So since the AIM-120 AMRAAM is still the backbone of the US Air Force's own air superiority capabilities, and almost all its allies as well, there will be a significant trade-off in terms of the security of the weapon, in terms of the way it works, the way its seeker behaves, and the weaknesses there. So I suspect Ukraine will not be sent the very top end, Charlie 7, 8 or Delta 3 versions of AMRAAM, because compromise of those weapons would be so damaging for US air superiority capabilities, not just in Europe, but also in the Middle East and particularly in the Indo-Pacific, and all their allies who all pretty much rely on AMRAAM. So I suspect it will be Charlie 3, maybe Charlie 5, so significantly shorter range, and less capable in a number of ways. This isn't just the US being paranoid, by the way. I've taken apart looked inside Russian air-to-air missiles that have been captured in Ukraine, having been fired, and there's been a lot of exploitation on the western side of Russian missiles that have been captured after being fired in various states of destruction or not. And that has been really useful for helping optimize self-defense suites and electronic countermeasures and things. This goes on with any weapon system that is sent into theater on both sides, but it's not just the US, not wanting Ukraine to win or something. This is a really serious consideration. And that will also apply to air-to-ground munitions. So, if you were just looking at it as a tactical problem, you might well want things like JASSM, sort of air-launched cruise missile, or JASSM-ER. But of course, JASSM and JASSM-ER are important parts of the US Air Force's own standoff air-to-ground capabilities, and are relied on by a number of NATO allies and Indo-Pacific allies. So again, there's a trade-off to be made there. I don't know which way that will go. More likely, I suspect, would be things like JSOW, so Joint Standoff Weapon, which is essentially a more capable glide bomb type system, which can also have cluster munition variants. They can actually give us reasonably surprising standoff range when lobbed at high speeds in a short pop-up. So in conjunction with decent mission planning and an ability to suppress your way in with things like harm and potentially AMRAAM shots, there are definitely options there. But again, no confirmation in public sources about whether those sort of weapons will be sent. If it's just JDAMs, for example, GBU-62, which is it's actually normally an anti-ship version of JDAM, but GBU-62 version of JDAM with the wing kit, the glide kit, which has been used quite a lot in Ukraine from Ukrainian aircraft at the moment. The F-16 will enable better kind of interface between the pilot and the weapon than is currently possible, but it's not fundamentally changing what that weapon can and can't do. And in terms of the really big prize, which would be Meteor, the European Meteor missile, which would give the sort of effective engagement ranges from a low altitude position relatively close to the front lines towards a high altitude flanker, doing glide bomb releases or a combat air patrol quite a long distance behind the Russian front lines, Meteor isn't integrated in F-16, and even were it to be carried, the radar probably wouldn't support it at the ranges that you would need. The ranges that you would be employing Meteor to gain significant advantage with. So it's not really an option there.
What is the selection criteria actually for the pilots here? Because they're being retrained, or they're being newly trained on an F-16, and what sort of skills are likely to be the core part of their curriculum?
So there are two processes underway in parallel. One of them is a program retraining existing Ukrainian pilots who speak enough English and who are current enough to transfer them from their existing types, MiG-29, Sukhoi-27, Sukhoi-24, across to F-16. And that is the kind of cohort that are potentially going to be sent in relatively soon, because that is a faster process, albeit in some ways a more difficult process than training new people from scratch. The issue there being that you're having to unlearn quite a lot of core skills, which, it's almost more difficult the more combat experience these people have on older Soviet pattern aircraft in the Ukrainian Air Force, especially if it's combat experience and therefore is deeply ingrained, because the aircraft work in a completely different way. Missions are planned and flown in a completely different way. There's a lot more GCI input, ground controller input, both in terms of things like radar operation, weapons employment, and threat reaction. It's in the Ukrainian and formerly Soviet and Russian way of flying. There's a lot of sort of ground controller input into that process, and sorties tend to be tasked and planned with predominantly army control, because in both the Russian and the Ukrainian and the Soviet systems, the air forces were very much subordinate to the army within the kind of joint force. And so trying to take people who, it's not just transferring from a different aircraft that operates very differently. It's a completely different way of planning and executing sorties and employing tactics at almost every level. There's a huge amount more cockpit autonomy and also mission planning autonomy that you need to operate the Western way. And F-16 is quite tightly honed around the Western way of operating. But by dint of being relatively small and as light as it possibly can be, everything in the design philosophy is fairly tightly kind of bound around maximizing the utility of Western tactics in all the different mission sets where possible. But of course, if you fly it in a different way and expect it to just be highly effective by dint of being Western tech and therefore generally a bit more advanced, it's not going to give you the combat capability you need. It's still a 1970s design with upgraded electronics, but to a point. Being thrown into a threat environment in terms of the surface-to-air threat and the air-to-air threat that in the West we would not have anything other than 5th gen going in as the leading edge with a huge amount of support. So they're going to have to be very tactically good. So for those people transitioning from existing jets, that's really, really difficult, because they're not just having to learn things in a relatively truncated course much faster than we would normally do it, with only the kind of bits that are most relevant or seen as most relevant to the combat environment in Ukraine. But they're also having to try and unlearn a whole load of skills and instincts and mental processes which might have made them, very effective within the bounds of what their equipment could do in the Ukrainian types, but it's not going to work well in F-16. Then you have the second parallel process, which is essentially training pilots from scratch, again in a relatively truncated way, as fast as possible, through a range of different partners, so the UK, France, the US, a number of other partners, providing essentially training from basic flight training upwards, to try and produce a second, larger group of pilots who will then convert onto F-16 in the US and in Romania, who hopefully will, albeit they will not have that combat experience, but they also won't have essentially bad habits to unlearn. And so, again, truncated course, a lot of the kind of, for example, they're probably not going to spend a huge amount of time training for dogfighting, because in the environment that they're going to be operating in, there's very, very little chance that aircraft will come into close proximity to each other, because of the ground-based threat on both sides and the kind of posture that both sides are doing. So you'd expect that probably spend most of their time looking at long-range, beyond visual range combat, and strikes on ground targets in fairly contested environments. So again, that kind of classic close air support skill set, which Western air forces have spent a lot of time honing, and of course most F-16 units in the US and elsewhere have spent the majority of the last 25 years concentrating on, is not really particularly relevant in Ukraine, because those tactics revolve around using targeting pods from a medium altitude hold in an orbit, interacting with JTACs, or Joint Terminal Attack Controllers, or whatever the terminology of the armed forces you're looking at, to be talked onto and identify targets using 9-line formats, and then ID them with a targeting pod and set up for the run-in on exactly the kind of heading and altitudes and release points that the JTAC has authorized. You can't do that in Ukraine. There's just no way to sit at medium altitude anywhere near the front lines within range of a targeting pod to kind of look at and take your time to ID targets. The ground-based threat and the fighter threat doesn't allow that. So all of those skills that are very complicated to execute, probably not particularly necessary. So there are ways that you can practically take stuff off these courses and do it more quickly. But yeah, so those are the two kind of approaches: the conversion, which is quicker but potentially brings more difficulties in terms of not flying the jet but operating the jet, and then the from scratch pipeline, which will perhaps generate people with less experience flying in combat, well, definitely less experience flying in combat scenarios, but will probably generate people who are more able to learn the Western tactics quickly over time. But it is also worth stating that it's not just knowing the formation tactics. So typically in a Western fast jet squadron, with all the access to all of the training facilities, no water fight, and the ability to fly in airspace alongside lots of really experienced colleagues being guided by them, you would take maybe a year to 18 months to qualify to lead a two-ship, so to be an element lead. And then for really good people who are absolutely top of the game, they might qualify for their four-ship lead qualification, so flight lead, in the end of their 3-year tour, their first 3-year tour, so after 3 years of being combat ready on the front line. Most people will tend to be sort of halfway through their second tour, so after about 4.5 years on the front line. But then in actual complex combat situations with a high threat, you wouldn't expect a basic four-ship lead instructor pilot, to be leading those formations. You would want a weapons instructor. And those people, again, if you're very good and the Air Force is struggling for weapons instructor candidates, you might get people who are extremely gifted going through the weapons instructor training course after 3 years, having got their four-ship quals. And some of them will fail because it's very hard. Ideally, traditionally, you would have people after their second frontline tour, so 6 years on the front line, going through the weapons instructor course. And then those are the sort of PhD level tactics instructors and combat leaders. So those are who you would want in those environments, to be not just flying the four-ship tactics in a kind of exercise environment, but actually planning them, briefing everybody, and then leading the formations in combat, and kind of coordinating all of that. So, the Ukrainians, by either training route, are not going to have had anything like enough time to generate people with that kind of expertise.
You started mentioning this as well now, with sort of the training of the different mission sets that is available, with probably long-range engagement, air-to-air engagements being the first sort of thing that is being taught in terms of combat skills. What sort of air operations do you then expect to see on the Ukrainian side with the first introduction of the F-16?
I think the majority of what they'll be doing when they initially come into theatre will be contributing. Well, first of all, they'll be practicing the concept of operations, which will have to have an element of dispersal both on the main bases and dispersed operations at various sites around the country. Not least because if they're flying at low level for a lot of the time that they're within a couple of 100 kilometers of the front lines to stay underneath the SAM threat, they'll be using a great deal of fuel. As you know from flying the Gripen, when you're at very low level, your fuel flow is in a jet engine is anywhere from about 5 times to more than 10 times the fuel flow that you would have for the same indicated airspeed at high altitudes. Jet engines just burn a lot more fuel lower down. And because the Ukrainians don't have and couldn't use air-to-air refueling tankers, they'll have to land to refuel. And so again, if they're doing long combat missions, just as now, they'll have to use forward refueling points. So again, that dispersed operations model, especially if they're talking about pilots who haven't flown it before in other types, if they're coming out of the ab initio training, that will take some time to get used to. F-16 is not really designed for that, and so there'll need to be some work up there. But during that time, they can be contributing to sort of air defense inside the country. So potentially trying to intercept, particularly Shahed 136 type one-way attack munitions, maybe cruise missiles. That's a pretty difficult mission set, especially without an active electronically scanned array type radar, because these are small targets. The cruise missiles, some of them, the KH-101s, we'd say AS-23, have a relatively low radar cross-section, and they'll be flying low, so you're trying to potentially pick them out of ground clutter. And again, with the APG-68, it's not easy. But also, even Sidewinders are pretty expensive compared to Shaheds. Cruise missiles, not so much. That's a pretty decent exchange, but it's not a be-all or end-all answer to the internal air defense side. But no doubt they'll have some utility there and provide a threat in being to act as a further deterrent for Russian forces trying to push air, whether rotary air or fixed wing, across the Ukrainian front lines. So they'll have value there, and they'll no doubt be doing some launching of weapons air to ground in much the same way as the current Ukrainian aircraft are doing. So lobbing glide bombs and that sort of thing, launching harm for air defense suppression and targeting. So yeah, I think that'll be the baseline. The difficulty is likely to be that if you're talking about going after the glide bomb sorties, which are one of the key requirements at the moment, because the glide bombs are causing a lot of damage and a lot of problems. F-16 is unlikely to give Ukrainians the effective range to do that. At least not without flying missions that have, should we say, a very high risk profile. Because a traditional air-to-air missile like AMRAAM, it has a rocket motor. That rocket motor might fire for, call it 7 or 8 seconds, depending on the variant, depending on the circumstance, but call it 7 or 8 seconds. So during that time, the missile is accelerating. So you can imagine already that if you fire that AMRAAM from Mach 1.4 at 35,000 feet, then it's already high. It's already in relatively thin air. There's already not much drag. And if you loft it slightly, so you pull up, by the time that motor is burned out, it could be at 60,000 feet where there's almost no drag at all, with a huge amount of gravitational energy and at many times the speed of sound. And so following the motor burnout, that missile would then have a huge amount of energy to glide through the rest of its flight. And so when it arrives at a target that may be maneuvering, it's got quite a lot of energy to kind of make turns to try and complete the intercept. And if the target turns away and is trying to run away, it's still got a reasonable amount of energy to try and catch up to it, although a fast jet turning cold, so turning away and igniting the afterburners to try and go in the other direction because it knows it's been fired at is a very difficult target for air-to-air missiles to catch up to unless the missile is fired very close. just because the fighter has power and can accelerate in the opposite direction, whereas the missile is just coasting at that point and losing energy all the time. But if you fire that same missile that might go, tens and tens of kilometers with a decent effective range, from Mach 1.4 at 35,000 feet, that same missile fired from Mach 1-ish, or maybe 0.9 even, at 200 feet, is starting in very dense air at a slower speed. So there's a lot more drag. That motor burn will accelerate it to a significantly lower speed up front. If the target is, as Russian flankers would be and glide bomb sorties would be, at high altitudes and speed, that missile is also having to climb during its motor burn. So it's to go from the low altitude you fired it to the high altitude where the target is. So by the time the motor burns out, again, the same 7 or 8 seconds, it's probably only at a couple of times the speed of sound. It's still climbing, so it's going to be losing speed quickly. And so the effective range of that same missile will be vastly shorter than if you fired it at supersonic speeds at high altitude. And this really matters in Ukraine because it's not really possible to take something like an F-16 and accelerate to supersonic speeds at high altitude. That takes time. That takes minutes, typically with a fuel load of a couple of tanks or a centerline tank. And the more fuel you carry, the more drag you'll have. With 2 tanks, you take longer to accelerate even at high altitude. So you have to be up at altitude for some time, which means that you'll be visible to long-range Russian SAMs, S-400s, S-300s, and you can be engaged at hundreds of kilometers. So even if you detect that you've been fired at and you turn to notch and probably go down back to low altitude and turn cold to try and defeat that shot, your air-to-air engagement is now gone. You can't. So you can't do those engagement profiles anywhere near the front lines in Ukraine. As the Ukrainian Air Force. So I don't think F-16 with AMRAAM, especially the versions they're likely to get, is going to provide an immediate answer to those glide bomb threats, because the glide bombs are being released from 60, sometimes more, kilometers behind the Russian front lines at high altitudes and speeds by definition. So they're a pretty difficult target to intercept. So the combination of radar performance not being fantastic, the weapon being relatively short range when fired from low altitudes, just means that mission profile is probably pretty difficult to do. You'd have to go very close to the front lines, pop up, fly at high altitudes for a significant period to try and get that missile reach, and coordinate the timings perfectly and hope you weren't shot down by ground-based air defenses. And of course, the Russian fighters will also be engaging with their long-range air-to-air missiles from a high perch down to the low. So with R-37M or AA-30, with much more powerful radars. So this is not a wonder weapon. It will provide some benefits for Ukraine, but it's not going to sort of get them air superiority all of a sudden. That's not within the realms of possibility for the system.
I mean, on that note, it of course depends on what the Ukrainians want to do with their F-16s. But given sort of the numbers that we find, in the public domain of how many F-16s are likely going to be sent in this sort of first delivery, where the figures are somewhere between a squadron sized, plus a dozen aircraft perhaps. How many aircraft would Ukraine actually need to have a sort of field a credible force, where it can then extend the activities of the F-16 beyond just doing this a little bit of air defense that it probably would do in the first run up?
The Ukrainian public estimates for the rough size of force they need is somewhere between 180 and 200 aircraft. It's about 4 regiments worth in their system. But I mean, first of all, it's worth stating that the limitation at present is not the number of F-16s that partners have undertaken to donate. There are more F-16s being donated to Ukraine than there are pilots ready to fly them. So pilots is the limitation. And by the way, the same thing goes for the Gripen argument of, well, but there aren't that many Gripens around, so how could they be available in big enough numbers? There are more Gripens than there are pilots to fly them. So that's not the issue. So the numbers that will go in will depend on a few factors. Firstly, pilots, how many pilots are at an acceptable level. Secondly, maintenance crews. So how many contractors do you have to support how many Ukrainian maintenance teams and how capable are they with what ground support equipment, and how many locations can they operate around in a dispersed way within the resources and personnel that they can allocate. And then there'll be a trade-off between how much air defense you can place and missile defense you can place around main operating bases to force the Russians to really fire big salvos to get through, versus whether you try and go for a low-profile dispersed operational model. But in any case, the more aircraft you give the Ukrainians in country, the harder that challenge becomes to keep them ahead of the Russian surveillance and long-range reconnaissance strike complex. The numbers that are likely to be supportable in country anytime soon will fall a very long way short of that estimate for what Ukraine would need to kind of have its needs met from an F-16 point of view. That is a much more long-term project. Again, it's about opportunity cost in all things. So there are plenty of things that could be useful for Ukraine, weapon systems, donations of all sorts of things. But everything comes with an opportunity cost. Everything takes people. Funding too, but most of all people, particularly English-speaking people who have the right skill sets. And there is just a finite number of those people who are needed for everything from Leopard tanks, Abrams, Bradleys, artillery, logistics of all sorts, air defense systems, trying to fix the electricity grid alongside Western partners. All of these things, and run training establishments for infantry, armor, staffs for brigades. All of these things constantly need doing. There's not enough of anything. Ukraine is trying to balance all of these desperate competing demands as our partners in terms of what they can allocate to try and meet those needs. And so everything you donate that the Ukrainians then have to support is going to come with a cost in terms of how many people they have to allocate to it. So if it's not a question of whether something is potentially useful for various mission sets, it is something the best use of the people and resource that will have to be allocated in order to train on it and then bring it into country and then operate it. And if the answer is no, then something might be useful, but other things should remain the priority. And the classic fighter example of this is the French announcement on Mirage 2000-5. In many ways a wonderful aeroplane. I mean, I think it's probably the most beautiful fighter ever made. But it's slightly more complex to support than F-16 in most respects. It's a little bit more tolerant of rough fields from a FOD point of view. But the key thing is it has even more serious range limitations in air-to-air terms than the F-16 with AMRAAM, because the Mica missile, which is all that it can fire, is shorter range than an AMRAAM-C. And there are also, by the way, fewer of them. So given that it would also, just like F-16 or Gripen or anything else, take a huge number of relatively scarce trained people, pilots, maintenance crews, all sorts, and airbase preparation capacity to induct a fleet, it's just not the right use of resource to put people towards Mirage 2000 when they could go towards ground-based air defense, F-16 or Gripen most of all, which, and I know I'm always banging on about Gripen, but it's because in the specific case of Ukraine's requirements, Gripen is by far the most efficient way to allocate resources for a fighter replacement effort, because it's much easier to support. It's much more suitable for dispersed operations than F-16. It's also much easier to train on because of the amount of automation in the cockpit process. So for people who are trying to get their heads around all sorts of completely different ways of operating and different tactics compared to what they're used to, or training from scratch, the Gripen does a lot more of those kind of mental processes for you, just because the philosophy is to take as much load off the pilot as possible in terms of all those different range, fuel, time calculations, all of that. It's got a better EW suite. Its radar is slightly more capable than the APG-68. It's a more modern design. It's got more modern software, and it has the capacity for Meteor. So you add it up. It's sort of frustrating to have seen over the years, the last couple of years, people say, well, if you're in favor of this, you must be against that. It's like, it's not. it's not that F-16 doesn't offer value. It's not that Mirage 2000 wouldn't theoretically offer value. It's where's the best use of very limited capacity, people, and time. And as we've discussed, F-16 hopefully going ahead relatively soon, but it will have significant operational limitations.
I mean, in that sense, you talked about the difficulties with pilot training and the challenges there, or you've gone over to the maintenance and logistics aspect as well. In what way does the introduction of the F-16 then pose challenges to the Ukrainian Air Force from sort of a command and mission management perspective? Because as you've mentioned before, they used to completely different fighters and mission setups. And now they suddenly have an aircraft that works very differently.
With any Western fighter, one of the core challenges for the Ukrainian Air Force, once they have aircraft in country and pilots and maintenance crews trained to the right standard, is also trying to win the ability to operate them according to those Western tactics within the Ukrainian command and control system, which is still extremely heavily dominated by the army. And it's primarily a land war. It's not saying that is overall a bad thing, but if you're generating and tasking sorties based on army requirements for a bomb here, a bomb there, air cover, quote unquote, for this area for this time, and the implementation remains rigid, then you're going to be those F-16s or anything else are going to be forced into very, very suboptimal mission profiles, timings, and having to operate in ways that don't minimize the risk and maximize the return, because they're being tasked by people who don't understand how fast air works and what the kind of limitations and strengths are. And of course, you also got to bear in mind that even within the Ukrainian Air Force, there is a hierarchy of people that, a lot of the commanders are not people who understand even Ukrainian style fighter operations. They're ground-based air defenders, because, thank goodness for Ukraine in terms of its defense over the last 2 and a bit years, it's the ground-based air defenses that have saved Ukraine from the Russian Air Force, which could have devastated the country and prevented a successful ground defense. But because Ukraine had this fantastic, extensive ground-based air defense network and a relatively limited fast air capability on relatively aging platforms, a lot of those senior commanders in the Ukrainian Air Force are ground-based air defenders. So they're very good at what they do, but they're not necessarily people who understand the in-depth requirements, strengths, weaknesses, dependencies that fast air brings, particularly Western fast air. So there will also need to be a kind of an effort and a broader understanding within the Ukrainian system of the need to give more mission command style delegation of authorities and operating planning capabilities to the squadrons that are getting these things, or the regiments that are getting these things. Because again, if they try to operate them like they're used to, then it's not going to go very well.
Yeah. And then sort of as a final question, let's think about the challenges, opportunities of the F-16 itself. Is there anything you don't see discussed that often where you say this is something that is actually quite important? Now, I understand you've given us sort of a comprehensive rundown already, but in the discussion that we have with the F-16, what sort of pops to mind where you would say that's a challenge, we need to think about that, and that's an opportunity that really should be appreciated more?
The biggest one would be the need to find a sustainable way and prove it to destroy Russian medium-level surveillance UAVs penetrating deep into Ukrainian airspace before Western fast jets of any kind are deployed in country. Because if they're deployed without an answer to that particularly Orlan 10 problem, so these are medium altitude, long endurance, small reconnaissance UAVs which can fly above the reach of shoulder-fired manpads and AAA generally. And at the moment, Ukraine is struggling to shoot them down because there isn't enough ground-based air defense ammunition for the bigger systems to quote unquote waste them on these small UAVs. There needs to be a way of sustainably keeping those out of in deep Ukrainian airspace. Otherwise, it will be almost impossible to run the sort of dispersed operations that are going to be necessary to stay ahead of Russian targeting, which will concentrate on those F-16s or Gripens or anything else that are put in because they're such a politically sensitive target and represent a potentially capable asset for Ukraine. So the Russians will target them. We saw 3 weeks ago, we saw 4 days in a row of strikes on Ukrainian main air bases targeted by Orlan 10s, which were loitering for a couple hours in some cases over those bases and then calling in ballistic missile strikes. If that sort of thing is going on, then it doesn't matter how good your dispersed concept of operations is, that will be a killer. Not just of the aircraft and the aircrew, but also the ground crew and the maintenance staff and the ground support equipment. So, yeah, that I think is a dependency that's not often discussed as much, but that must be fixed before the fast jets go in. Otherwise, they'll be destroyed on the ground.
Thank you, Justin. Well, I mean, this is a very comprehensive rundown of the challenges and also the opportunities that are behind the F-16 deliveries to Ukraine. So we, of course, wish Ukraine all the best with the aircraft and hope that they can put them to work. Thank you very much for the discussion. And as always, everybody else, thank you very much for the support to the channel. And see you in the sky.
I hope that you enjoyed that. If you did, if you want to add anything, want to provide some feedback, some analysis of your own, or just want to say, hey, I learned something here, put them in the comments below. They are open as always for all of you. Big thank you here to Justin Bronk for his time and answering all the questions. Please also put your appreciation to him in the comments below. And also all Patreons and channel members, thank you for making this channel possible. Check your feeds for all the early access videos that are available. And as always, everyone, have a great day and see you in the sky.